Hello and welcome to Team West Covina, a Crazy Ex-Girlfriend podcast. I'm your host Paisley, and today is Sunday, July 14th, 2019. This is episode 14 of the podcast, and we're discussing the episode That Text Was Not Meant for Josh, Season 1, Episode 11. Before we go into the episode, I just wanted to say thank you to our latest patron, Steen. I'm so happy that people are finding and supporting the podcast even after Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is over. It definitely inspires me to keep finding time to create episodes. And speaking of time, I'll go into this a little bit more at the end of the podcast, but I have been a little bit busier than usual lately. The last 2 months have been my biggest travel months of the year this year, and so I haven't actually been home a whole lot, and when I have, I've been working on my business and a lot of things that go along with that. But I did get concert tickets for Rachel's upcoming shows that she's doing. I'll be at the Chicago Rachel show and possibly the Milwaukee one, but it's looking a little less likely for Milwaukee because I already have concert tickets for something else that day, and they rescheduled it on us. I have Milwaukee tickets right now, but the day they rescheduled it to, I already have a concert, so I may just take the refund on that. I'll just have to see how it goes. But if anybody will be there, feel free to send me a message and let me know. I'd love to meet up with other fans. So going into That Text Wasn't Meant for Josh, it aired on February 8th, 2016. It was written by Elizabeth Kiernan Averick and directed by Daisy von Schurler-Meyer. And the Netflix synopsis is, Rebecca accidentally sends Josh a text professing her love for him, then has to break into his house and delete it before he gets home. As always, there's a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the whole series, we are going to be talking about it in depth, and we might reference things that happen in later episodes, so just so you guys are aware going forward. This is one of my favorite Season 1 episodes, I have to say. I would say this one and the camp episode for sure. We'll see what else as I go through another rewatch here. It opens with Scott and Paula in Father Bra's office, and they're having a sort of therapy session. Scott mentions Paula came home a couple weeks ago. I remember she was all dressed up and said she was unhappy. So this is a nod to when Paula came home from the jazz club and hotel where she spent time with Calvin and almost slept with him. She was wearing that red dress. She was all dressed up. So they really keep the continuity with that. Father Bra thinks Paula is self-sabotaging, probably because at this point she doesn't believe that her marriage can be saved. I also felt like Father Bra seemed a little ditzier or kookier in this scene than in other ones. He's given better and more serious advice to Josh, and we've seen him really present with Valencia in season 4. So I'm not sure exactly what was going on with him today, but it's funny because in the scene itself, he actually says his aim is really off today. When we first see Rebecca, she's putting her shoes on right next to the happily ever after rocks that become so important later in this episode. They actually have a shot of that for a split second and pan up. I think that's so smart to establish it ahead of time, even if it's a little subliminal. Greg stops over at Rebecca's apartment, and he's fishing to see if Rebecca cares that he's with Heather. She does ask about it, but it's not clarified until later in the episode whether she's actually jealous or just misses the attention and having a singular focus. I've definitely seen girls behave like that in real life when they don't even like a guy, but they're used to the guy liking them, and their pride can't handle it when the guy goes for someone else instead. Rebecca may also dislike that her alternate option is off the table now. Next we see Rebecca at Boba, and you'll notice that the Olsen twins' size is actually humongous when Rebecca orders a drink there. When Rebecca's reciting her speech for what she might say about her most recent case, she mentions that the defendant is liable for court costs and interest accrued in the period of June 2013. So as far as the timeline goes, we know it's later than that, but it doesn't help us determine whether it makes sense for the show to start in 2015 or 2016, which seem to be the two main contenders. We see Rebecca keep struggling to hold back her I love yous throughout the episode. First up, she laughs really hard at Josh's joke and says, I love you, your sense of humor. And just the way she hugs him, how she enjoys it so much. It's such a good yet frustrating feeling. Her feelings are practically coming off her face and out of her voice, and she's just having more and more trouble hiding how important he is to her. When Rebecca is meeting with lawyers at the office, the address given for the defendant is 533 East Cameron, so that's yet one more thing on East Cameron, their running joke. If you listen to what the lawyer is saying in the background, it's that the rent payment is due by the 5th of each month, and any day beyond the 5th, a fee of $3,500 will incur. That's more than most people's rent. Just in case you forgot what the infamous text said, it basically summed up Rebecca's entire story. Just saw Josh. He looked so hot that I almost died. I love him so much, and I think he loves me now too. God, I can't wait until we're finally together and I can stop lying and tell him I love him and moved here for him. Oh my gosh, that's the worst nightmare, to send all of that to the person in question. It's like accidentally letting somebody inside your head when you didn't want them to know. And then to have it happen at work and she's panicking. They do a really great job of slowing down time and distorting people's voices to kind of capture the fear and panic. I really liked probably the direction of this episode, a lot of the camera choices. I noticed a lot of those types of stylistic things here too. And good on Paula for setting boundaries when she tells Rebecca she can't go help her break into Josh's house because she's having dinner with Scott. Of course, Paula's dying to be a part of this for the adventure, and she also has a deep craving to help Rebecca, but she doesn't bail on her husband. I also really love that Rebecca casts the lawyers in her musical fantasy. They become the soundtrack cheering her on. It's really funny that rather than dishing out disapproving comments, they all completely get it and support that Rebecca's personal life trumps work at that very moment. Casa de las Flores is where Josh and Valencia live. We see Rebecca in front of Josh's apartment. She says through text, "I am fake texting so I look like I'm waiting for my friend." Then she gets in the door when someone else comes out of it. It actually reminds me of me trying to see Rebecca's apartment in West Covina, and when someone went through the locked gate, I ended up going in too. In the middle of the text emergency song, we see the ghost of Steve Jobs, and he says, "Technology is slowly alienating everyone from their loved ones. When you send a few words to the wrong recipient and it destroys your entire life." This is basically part of the premise that Rachel and Aline base the show on, that technology has affected our romantic life so much, whether it's texting or social media or how we see what everybody else is doing and get a little bit more FOMO. More comparing goes on because you see more pictures from other people's lives and videos. And then the way people present their digital selves are sometimes different than how it's really going for them in their real life. The next scene, we get to see Josh and Valencia's apartment, and they have a shit ton of owls. I'm not sure which one likes owls. I'm going to assume Valencia because she's probably the one who decorated, but they have the owl outside the door, which everybody knows from the song. But then they also have an owl hanging by the front door inside, and there's an owl sitting on the side table next to the couch. So, tons of owls. Rebecca needs to break the passcode to get into Josh's phone. In reality, I feel like this might be an even harder part of trying to delete this text. But of course she knows the last 4 of his social security number. As it turns out, Valencia's birthday is the passcode, and we learn that it's May 5th, 1988. This means she's a Taurus, for one thing, which is ruled by Venus and actually makes sense for a yoga instructor or somebody in touch with their body. She's also got that stubborn streak and enjoys beautiful material luxuries. Also, we can comment on the timeline a little bit more if we know Valencia's birthday. So if it's 2015 when the show begins, not counting camp, that would make Valencia 27. If it began in 2016, that would make Valencia 28 here in season 1. If we were past her birthday this year, which we may not be, but we know it must have already passed from 2015 to 2016 or 2016 to 2017 because we already had the Christmas episode earlier in season 1. And then you've got to look at how that ties in with when they have their high school reunion several years late and things like that. All these little things do make it challenging to fit the timeline together, as we know Josh, Valencia, Father Bra, and some of the others went to high school together and were all part of the class reunion. We know Josh is 16 in 2005 at Camp Canyon Grove, meaning he would have been born in 1989, and he's a Pisces, so that would mean last half of February or early March 89. Rebecca would have been born right after him in late March or early April. But Valencia would already be 17 by the time Rebecca and Josh go to Camp Canyon Grove, assuming it takes place in summer, so that implies she was a year ahead of Josh in school. Yet they both seem to be part of the class that had the reunion. The timeline will continue to be an ongoing thorny issue, I'm sure. I appreciate that Rachel kind of carved out a timeline at the end of the series and decided that officially it starts in 2016, other than the flashback. But with things that actually get mentioned in the show itself, it is kind of hard to reconstruct the timeline after the fact, I think. I think when we look at Rachel's timeline that she did at the end of the show, it's probably what she intended and what she would have done had the timeline been planned out beforehand. We also see Rebecca's chagrin at Josh using Valencia's birthday as a passcode. It makes her think that he really loves her. And that makes things so much harder than if Josh wasn't in love but stayed with her anyway. Regardless, though, even being in love with someone doesn't mean they're right for you or that you're right for them. There's this ongoing tension and relief throughout the episode that really drives the drama. Rebecca is super panicked about the text, then experiences immense relief when it's deleted. Then she opens the door and Josh is standing there, so the tension wraps up again. Then she gets through a break-in story and all of a sudden Josh is comforting her. Relief. But he decides he needs to take her back to her house and check on the broken glass situation. More tension again. Once Scott throws the rock through the window, we experience relief. Then Josh questions why the break-in happened. More tension. Rebecca's able to placate him and get him to agree to have fondue. We get back to relief. After that, Josh tells her he called the cops, though. So once more, we've got tension and relief after Rebecca is able to lawyer her way out of filing a police report. We think we're finally out of the woods, but then Josh discovers the rock that says ever, starts to question everything, and leaves abruptly, and we're back to tension again. We go through this tension and relief cycle at least 6 times in this episode, which is part of the reason it's so well written. I can imagine what it's like to live this because I feel like I've been there when it comes to these heavy ups and downs that really mess with your mind. In the next scene, we see Scott and Paula trying really extra hard at dinner. Scott suggests holding hands, which is what she wanted for so long. She says in the Calvin episode that it's been years since somebody's held her hand. But in reality, it turns out to be kind of awkward and not romantic. We cut back to Rebecca and Josh, and Rebecca keeps saying, slow down, as she struggles to come up with a lie that Josh might buy. She continues to do this throughout the episode when talking with the cop. We hear the little sound effect that means she's lying when she hears Josh say break in, and this gives her the idea for her cover story. Josh totally buys that the door to his apartment was unlocked because he forgets to lock it sometimes. He asked if he left the fridge open too, and Rebecca actually rolls with this and finds a way to take credit. She says, yes, you did, and I closed it and saved a lot of cold cuts, which leads Josh to actually thank her for breaking in. Classic Rebecca. There's this great cork metaphor for Paula and Scott's marriage when they're opening up the wine bottle. This is pretty great. When Scott tries to open it up, he only comes up with half a cork. And Paula says, ugh, just push it through. And Scott's saying, no, we can save the cork. We can save our marriage. And Paula says, no, we can't. Be realistic, okay? We just got to push the cork through and drink the wine with the dirty little pieces of cork in it. Is it great? No, but that's life. You can tell she's just bristling with anger and frustration. She kind of thinks, we all just have to get through this. We're a family. We're married. We're not going to make some big change or get divorced, but we just kind of gotta get through this, even if it's not ideal. Scott takes a knife, and I believe he's listening to her and trying to push the cork through, as if they're both giving up. That's when the phone rings and Rebecca sends them on a mission. You can see how Paula's addicted to Rebecca's love life when she lies to Scott about why she has to answer the phone. First she says it could be about the kids, then she says it's her mother. Even though she agreed to put the phone down at the beginning of the meal, by the end she's giving up, thinking their marriage is just never going to fulfill her, and she wants to get back to Rebecca's fantasy love life. I absolutely love how Rebecca makes no sense on the phone and doesn't explain why she needs Paula to throw a rock through the window, but Paula immediately says, copy that, and is on it without question. That's friendship. Scott thinks Paula might be having an affair, and that's why she's getting phone calls all the time. It's interesting that she keeps this part of her life with Rebecca to herself at first, presumably because she doesn't think he'll understand, or worse, think it's stupid. I love how Scott gets excited about Paula's adventure, even though he doesn't know what's going on, and he's so excited when he helps her find a rock. Next, we cut to Rebecca and Josh at her house, and Scott has thrown the rock through the window, and Rebecca comes home to find it. And when she's talking to Josh, she says there's only one Josh Chan. And he says, actually, there's a lot of Josh Chans. I always think that's such a funny line. Paula actually confesses that she almost had an affair with a client, and Scott takes this in stride rather than trying to make her the bad guy, admitting that he almost slept with Misty from shipping. This is interesting because it isn't Tanya. Apparently Scott has more than one potential candidate at work. Both he and Paula recognize that they're in the same place mentally, and it's pretty amazing that they don't fight over this. It might have been hypocritical to get into an argument about it, since they're technically more or less even, but all the same, people aren't always rational about these things. Paula tells Scott that she doesn't want another man, and that's an interesting insight considering how she feels about her marriage. My guess would be then that at once upon a time, or maybe when they first got together, there was all this excitement and romance to some degree, and that she's missing that and she wants that from Scott, but she doesn't think she's going to get it. Rather than she's done with him and she wants to go get it from a fresh new person. It almost seems like that was a coping device, some of the stuff with Calvin, rather than the actual impetus. That's not always the case for everyone, so if that is what's true for Paula, it makes sense why they are able to reconcile and continue to work it out later on. I absolutely love that Paula and Scott go all the way through the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend theme song, but in spoken word, and believably too. Kudos to them. That was so funny. I always laugh at that part when I come back to it. It really worked, actually, within the context of the scene. So Josh helps Rebecca clean up the broken glass, and I noticed that he really does love to list things, which is mentioned in a much later episode when he thinks he might have a disorder of some kind. But we do see him do this multiple times. He says, I've got gloves for every situation. I mean, cleaning, baseball, golfing, driving, go-karts, boxing. And it's so ironic that it's the happily ever after rock that causes all these problems. That was pretty brilliant. Josh turns it over, sees it says ever, and then Rebecca automatically glances towards the floor where the other rocks are. If she hadn't done that, perhaps Josh wouldn't have put all the pieces together. Rebecca is trying so hard for her happily ever after, trying to make sure it's not spoiled, and yet she ends up making a mess anyway. Either way, Josh would have realized she was keeping something from him. Even if he had seen the original text, that would have been a confession to the other stuff she's keeping from him, so it's almost like she can't win. As Josh turns to go, Rebecca starts to say, Josh, I love you again, but finishes with, I love that you came to my rescue tonight. He accepts this, but you can see him roll his eyes as he walks out the door. When the fondue guy comes in, he talks about how they threw in some extra strawberries and chocolate, and Rebecca gets a clear picture of what could have been, how fun and romantic the night could have gone. She abhors missed opportunities. The fondue place, by the way, is called Fondue Me, like fondle me? And Rebecca, who has a habit of talking to delivery guys, says to him, moments ago he held me in his arms, and then, just now, he could barely look me in the eye. All of my dreams may have just been shattered. Like the glass window, of course. But she says may have been shattered. There's additional anxiety because Rebecca doesn't know if it's all over. She doesn't know if she ruined everything. It's ambiguous and confusing for both of them. As we launch into Rebecca's signature song, You Stupid Bitch, she says, it's so wonderful to be back here, even though I'm here singing this song a lot. So she really indulges in self-pity and self-hate over and over again, and it's a constant dialogue in her head that she comes back to again and again, but she kind of turns it into this fantasy number, as if an entire audience of people are hearing her and listening to her and singing along. There are so many reasons why this is the signature song of the series. It's about Rebecca's relationship with herself, and that's ultimately what the whole show is about in many ways. And she's being really vulnerable and honest, even if the way she pictures herself isn't always accurate, or even if she's seeing herself in a more extreme or skewed fashion than she needs to. The guilt and the shame and the struggle is just so real. And you can just tell how painful it is for her. And she feels like there's nothing she can do to fix it, like she always ends up back here. And then once again, we see Greg lurking around Rebecca's patio door. Rebecca throws her arms around Greg as soon as he walks in. She had already thanked Josh for rescuing her that night, and here it's clear that she sees Greg as her rescuer. Even just the fact that Greg is Josh's best friend makes him familiar and another link to Josh for her. She knows Greg has feelings for her, and she appreciates him as a person, but I don't think she's truly interested in him romantically yet. Right now, as she says, she just wants someone to stay with her and doesn't want to be alone. It's not specific to Greg. She does recognize that somehow you're always here when I need you, but normally that's when she needs comfort post-Josh. In a movie, this is the guy she'd end up with because he's always been there for her, but it's not always that simple in real life. Just because he's always there for her doesn't mean she can magically turn on romantic feelings for him. It's also pretty funny/sad that Rebecca asks Greg if he's hungry because she says, "I've got some fondue that's clumping together." Greg is literally sloppy seconds, as he points out when he sees Josh's name on the bag. The fondue guy made such a big deal about how they keep the cheese from congealing long enough for her and Josh to enjoy it. But by the time Greg comes around, it's in clumps, which is a pretty good metaphor for the situation. He's leftovers, essentially. Rebecca is left by both Josh and Greg in this episode after she already pulled some super elaborate stunts. It's like reliving the rejection of her father walking out twice in one day. It's a really deep trigger for her and brings her to a particularly dark place, especially since she once again feels like it's her fault. Interestingly, Scott is on the side of Greg, saying they might make a good couple, maybe she should give him a chance. It makes sense that he would root for the underdog who feels like their potential partner might just be settling for him. It's probably relating to Greg a little bit. Paula and Scott are so adorable when they're discussing Rebecca's story. They're both getting so excited about it. And their connection is just natural and free-flowing, and just having a night where they've made a connection like that makes all the difference in the world. It's not forced by this point. At the boba place, when Paula meets up with Rebecca, I love how Paula talks about how Rebecca's on a journey, and there's going to be peaks and valleys, and maybe even a long, dry, flat plateau, because Paula herself has been through that with Scott in her marriage. Anybody who's in it for the long haul is going to see those ebbs and flows in the relationship or the journey to the relationship, and being able to hang in there and recognize that it's not all going to be peaks is super important. It's also nice to see Paula so happy and optimistic for once. Paula tells Rebecca, know that everything is going to be okay, and if it's not, we will make it okay. She's such a good best friend. Then there's a tag at the end with Harry Spencer, the lawyer, confessing that he left his wife for a prostitute, same as the guy who created the butter ads. I'm not sure why they did it again, but interestingly, the guy who created the butter ads is named Gary, which rhymes with Harry. And I think there is more mention of this as we get later in the series. Before we move on to the next segments, if you'd like to support the podcast, feel free to donate as little as $2 on Patreon under Team West Covina. There'll be links in the show notes. It really helps cover the yearly hosting costs. It costs about $100 a year to keep these episodes up. So it'd be great to break even on that sort of thing. If anyone's able to rate or review the podcast, that would be a huge help towards growing the audience and helping it rank higher in search results. Even if you could just throw a few stars our way, that does mean a lot and seems to make a difference. We've actually gotten more downloads now since the show has been over. It's kind of picked up as far as people listening to podcasts and stuff, which kind of makes sense because everyone's missing the show, and so getting more content can be really important around this time. So in our Whodunit segment, we're looking at how many times Rebecca initiates plans to obtain Josh and how many times Paula instigates them. In this episode, not too much, because most of what we're doing is Rebecca's trying to pull some damage control. Rebecca asks if Josh wants some wine and then if he'd like to get some fondue, so she decides to turn the disaster into an opportunity. So this episode, Rebecca instigated once and Paula 0. The total so far is Rebecca has instigated 14 times with plans to get Josh, and Paula has started 8 of them. Our Ring of Fire segment was pretty busy this week, actually. I remember that there were a lot of fire references in like the really early episodes, like the one where Rebecca throws a party, but I didn't remember that there were so many in this one. First, Greg mentions some succulents, some candles you decorated when he visits Rebecca's place. And then when Josh talks about how much fun they had at camp, Rebecca says that campfire was so nice. Even in Rebecca's text, she says, just saw Josh, he looked so hot, but she used the fire emoji. And Connie the lawyer says there's only one option here, witness protection program. Burn it all down, start a new life. Holy foreshadowing. That's so interesting that it comes up this early. I mean, Rebecca did try to burn it all down and start a new life in the past, as we find out later. And even in You Stupid Bitch, Rebecca sings, you're just a lying little bitch who ruins things and wants the world to burn. So that's a solid 5 fire references right there. Our Suicide Watch segment, surprisingly there's nothing, but you can see how the you stupid bitch feeling could lead Rebecca to that dark place. Nothing for booze clues either, although I bet Greg did drink some after he got home from Rebecca's at the end. In our Nailed It segment, we look at the color-coded nail polish that Rachel sort of implemented behind the scenes. It's supposed to indicate Rebecca's mood. She's wearing black nail polish for most of the episode here. During the pivotal day when she accidentally sends the text, when she breaks into Josh's apartment and makes up a break-in story of her own, it's all black nail polish. And typically that means that she's pulling some kind of deception or is up to no good. I think Rebecca has dark blue nail polish on in the last scene instead of black. It's pretty dark, but I'm thinking this must indicate how despairing and self-pitying she feels in that moment. In the music notes segment, we look at what the song parodies were based on or inspired by. We've got 3 songs in this episode. Wow, back in the day when they had 3 songs per episode, amazing. We start with Textmergency, and I don't think I ever noticed that they're performing in White Feather before because they really make it look like a rock show. After the lawyers, plaintiff, and defendant finish their song, a bunch of papers shoot out from the copier, and the drum has a gavel on it. According to the songwriters on the Spotify commentary, this song originally started out as Thank You Technology, which would have been a parody of We Are the World. But the one-upmanship idea was Aline and Jack Dolgen kicking ideas around on set. Adam talked about how important it was to funnel the emotion into the moment. He told Rachel it wouldn't make sense to bring down the energy and do a depressing song, that it should have more urgency, and that was such a good call. Adam Schlesinger has really contributed a lot to the songs, but also just smoothing out and editing the songs and making them the best they can be. Then we also get Where is the Rock? Aline wrote the lyrics for this and Adam finished it. They liked the pun on 80s rock and a literal rock, and it's parodying Twisted Sister's I Wanna Rock with a similar melody, and they both have the band shouting rock in the background. By the way, in case you don't know, the person who played Connie, one of the lawyers, the blonde lawyer, she is actually played by Renee Goubet's wife, and Renee Goubet is, of course, Father Bra. So really neat connections there. Our last song for the episode is You Stupid Bitch. The shards of glass in the background are part of the chandelier behind Rebecca as she's singing. In the Spotify commentary, Rachel Bloom talks about how she was drinking and watching What'll It Be being filmed, and she was kind of going, Greg has a dramatic song, Rebecca should have a dramatic song too. And Shards and Lies was the first pass of this. That's what it was originally called. And Rachel said she was really nervous about sending the song in because it's so personal to her. It was apparently originally pages and pages, which I would love to read, and Adam kind of gave her a condensed version of it. It's also parodying Bernadette Peters doing a show, and the dress Rebecca wears even mirrors one of hers. Rachel fought to keep the line poopy little slut in, which is so on brand for her. Next, we move into the theme of the episode, and I would say the biggest one is trying to force a relationship rather than letting it happen naturally. Both Rebecca and Paula are in situations like that in this episode. Midway through, after their rock adventure, Scott and Paula are standing at the counter eating sandwiches or burritos, and they're so much happier than when they were forcing a formal steak dinner at the table. Meanwhile, while the initial chain of events was kicked off by an accident as far as the text goes, the accident involved Rebecca describing her internal plan to land Josh. She has to do a ton of damage control to keep that plan in motion. All the interactions with Josh, the things she says to him, inviting him to have wine and fondue, it's all calculated, whether beforehand or spontaneously. It's all designed to lead where? To Josh cheating on Valencia? To Josh confessing feelings? He already kind of did that, at least when it comes to admitting that he's attracted to her. Maybe she just wants him to say, I'm breaking up with Valencia and then we can be together. What exactly is she looking for from him at that moment? But that's also something Josh has to evaluate within his own relationship, independently of Rebecca, whether or not he's going to break up with Valencia. It's true that Rebecca gets him to think about it sooner than he would have otherwise, though, and it was more than time for that to happen. Nevertheless, trying to force a relationship never seems to work as well as letting it happen naturally and organically. And it is frustrating when people get stuck. Josh is stuck. He's stuck in this relationship with Valencia. He kind of knows it, but he's kind of in denial about it. And waking him up isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is hard to get it to work out before people are ready. Even if it's not right, even if it's just kind of making it worse for everybody for him to stay with Valencia. And that's tough. The other theme of the episode is settling, as we see discussed a lot throughout season 1. Greg is questioning whether he's settling for Heather because, as he points out, his girlfriend is 20 feet through that wall, but he's over here with Rebecca instead. And that tells him something, even if he doesn't like it. Even though this is off screen, we know Josh and Valencia are kind of settling for each other, as it turns out. We don't know Valencia is settling until maybe more like season 4 when we really get her backstory, but they are both settling for each other. And then Paula's really questioning whether she's settling with Scott or not, because she thinks their relationship is so hopeless. And when compared to Rebecca's idealistic love, it doesn't even hold a candle as far as she's concerned. I mean, when Paula and Scott come off their rock adventure, it's almost like they had a great first date, or like they hadn't seen each other in, several years, and they got back together and are going out again. And it's fresh. It's being refreshed by doing something novel and different and exciting. We have our poll results from the last episode, which was a while ago. The question was, if young Paula's life was turned into a web series, what memory would you most like to see? Around 100 people voted. We had a lot of participation. 25% said they'd like to see Paula's high school relationship with Jeff. 28% said they'd like to see period sex at a party, which she references. And 47% said they'd like to see her breaking in and bed bombing various guys, which she does mention as a throwaway line in one of the episodes. So what that meant was she'd break into a guy's house, get into bed naked, and wait for them to come home. Paula was so adventurous back in the day. And now. Still now. Our last podcast question was, what's your take on Greg's feelings for Heather and Ashley and how that ties in with the feelings he later has for Rebecca? Why does he choose Heather over Ashley, who he's been pining for since kindergarten? This is the girl he meets at the party that Daryl throws. And we got a few really great responses from Reddit. So edited for time, but here's some of the most interesting comments. JJ Dasher on Reddit says, well, Heather has some keen insights into Greg's psychology. She's a generally insightful person after all. He really doesn't have those insights into her. It's one-sided. Also, Greg's got a quirkiness that he probably suppresses around Heather because he's trying to match her coolness, but it's a part of the character that I've always thought matched up nicely with Rebecca. He's the only other character who does weird accents or cites obscure facts or comes up with weird metaphors the way Rebecca does, for example. I don't see Heather goofily dancing with Greg at the taco festival or geeking out about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire or watching the dog show. The first time I watched the series, she says, I thought of Ashley as Greg's Josh. In my mind, Greg calls Ashley up during the flash forward year while Rebecca's off writing. This is in season 4. And they go on a few dates, but it fizzles out pretty quickly once he realizes he's evolved past high school. So thanks, JJ Dasher, for that comment. I think that was really insightful. And it is really interesting that Greg can be psychological. He can pick up on what other people are thinking and doing and what their motives are, but he doesn't apply that to Heather. It's almost like he doesn't even notice enough to do it. He sees it in Rebecca. He sees it in himself. He kind of psychoanalyzes Josh, but it never even occurs to him to think of her on this deeper level. We've got another comment from Giant Giraffe Toy on Reddit who says they establish Greg's commitment phobia in the previous episode so that when they introduce it again at the end of season 1, we can recognize that it's a pattern of his behavior rather than a problem specific to the relationship between him and Rebecca. I like what JJ Dasher says above about Ashley being Greg's Josh Chan, but I think the episode also puts Heather as the Greg in their dynamic, as she is the one pursuing and pushing the relationship despite knowing he's not really ready for that, and also he's into someone else. That's brilliant. I totally agree with all of that. It is really good that they establish Greg's commitment phobia early on, so we know it's not just Rebecca and that he really did want to be with her at the end of season 1. There's some really nice development there. And yeah, I never really thought about Heather being the Greg when you look at that triangle between Rebecca and Greg and Heather. But she is. I mean, she's cool, so we don't necessarily see it as much with her. She doesn't seem quite as needy as Greg. But I have always said that Heather's the one pursuing this relationship. It's really not Greg so much. Heather just decides that Greg is a neat guy and she wants to get to know him and she just goes for it. But Greg is always a little distracted and unsure, even though they do have fun together. So on to the poll question of this week. Best food or drink metaphor of the episode. We've got a few. Paula and Scott saving the cork, as in saving their marriage, or clumpy cheese leftovers equaling Greg, who's just sloppy seconds in this situation. We also have a couple podcast questions for this week. One is, how do you think Paula and Scott first met and got together? That's something I don't think we ever got to hear much about, and I'm really curious at what point and how that happened. The other podcast question is, if you'd accidentally sent a text like the one Rebecca wrote, how would you handle it? So if you'd like to answer those podcast questions or vote in the poll, please head over to my social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all under Team West Covina. You can also email me at paisley.podcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to rate and review if you get the chance. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.